Few people know that in the Soviet Union, a country where the very existence of the soul was officially denied, there were classified scientific programs dedicated to studying life after death, clinical death, reincarnation, telepathy, and even alleged contact with the deceased. These projects were not made public. They were never mentioned in newspapers, and their results were stored under strict secrecy. Yet they existed. They were funded, overseen, and analyzed at the highest levels. While state television claimed that consciousness was merely a product of the brain, behind closed doors in research institutes, experiments were being conducted that had the potential to undermine the entire Soviet scientific doctrine. Some of these experiments were never published. Others vanished along with the collapse of the USSR, and those who took part in them rarely speak about it, even decades later. All that remains today are fragments, scattered pieces of testimony, unofficial reports, and the occasional leak. But even this is enough to suggest one disturbing truth. Behind the mask of scientific materialism, the Soviet state was quietly exploring one of the oldest and most profound mysteries of human existence. Does consciousness truly die with the body? Or is there something more? Something that still lies just beyond the edge of understanding? In the 1970s and 1980s, the Soviet Union initiated a classified scientific program known as Project PSI. Officially, it was framed as a study of unusual psychophysiological reactions, but in reality, its focus extended far beyond what was publicly acknowledged. Under the cover of academic research, dozens of laboratories and institutions across the USSR were engaged in exploring phenomena such as telepathy, extrasensory perception, the possibility of consciousness existing outside the body, and even the detection of physical changes occurring at the moment of death. The project was overseen by the KGB and operated under strict secrecy. Importantly, it did not involve fringe mystics or pseudoscientists. Instead, it was staffed by physicists, neurophysiologists, engineers, and mathematicians, people with established credentials, many of whom also held military clearance. One of the most intriguing objectives within Project PSI was to monitor individuals during the dying process, using scientific instruments to detect any anomalies. In several reanimation and hospital settings, terminal patients were connected to infrared cameras, ultra-sensitive temperature sensors, and magnetometers capable of registering the slightest energetic fluctuations. Reports, never officially published, described brief bursts of heat or electromagnetic signals occurring at the precise moment of death. These spikes could not be explained by conventional biological processes such as muscle contractions, cessation of breathing, or body temperature changes. To some researchers involved, these anomalies hinted at what they cautiously described as a release of information, or a displacement of consciousness. The term soul was never used in official documents, but behind the restrained language, many sensed they were observing something deeply unsettling, something that challenged the materialist worldview of Soviet science. Within the PSY framework, other lines of inquiry included the study of so-called near-death dreams or visions. Some subjects who had been resuscitated after clinical death reported vivid, coherent experiences that included life reviews, intense light phenomena, and perceptions of being outside their physical bodies. Although such testimonies were difficult to categorize scientifically, they were meticulously recorded and analyzed. Researchers noted instances where patients appeared to know the exact time they would die, sometimes hours or even days in advance. In other cases, dying individuals mentioned visions of deceased relatives or reported hearing voices calling them by name. These were documented not as metaphysical claims, but as unexplained psychological phenomena. Nevertheless, the consistency of such accounts across regions and demographics left a mark on the investigators. None of these findings ever made it into academic journals or scientific conferences. The results were compiled into internal reports circulated only within high-level institutions tied to the security services, according to later recollections from some former participants. Even discussing the implications of these experiments outside closed meetings was discouraged. The official narrative that death is a purely biological event and consciousness ends with brain function remained untouched in public. Yet within the confines of Project PSI, Soviet scientists had quietly opened the door to a possibility that contradicted everything they had been trained to believe: that consciousness might not be bound entirely to the brain, and that something, however undefined, could survive beyond death. Perhaps the most mysterious and controversial research into altered states of consciousness in the Soviet Union was conducted by Professor Vladimir Rykov. Officially, Rykov worked within the framework of psychotherapeutic science, focusing on hypnosis as a tool for unlocking hidden human potential. But the outcomes of his sessions raised questions that reached far beyond mainstream psychology. Using deep hypnosis, Rykov would instruct his subjects to become someone else: an artist, a scientist, a composer from another era. What followed often defied explanation. People with no prior training in painting began to produce complex artworks. Others began speaking in unfamiliar languages, demonstrating skills and knowledge they had never acquired. In some cases, the information recalled under hypnosis included detailed historical references, names, and dates that the subject could not have reasonably known. Rykov himself never publicly endorsed the idea of reincarnation. He was careful to describe his work in terms acceptable to Soviet science: suggestibility, creative self-activation, the unleashing of latent memory. However, some of his colleagues later suggested a different interpretation. Perhaps what Rykov had tapped into was not simply memory, but access to a broader informational field. Something akin to Carl Jung's collective unconscious, or in more speculative terms, the residual consciousness of another person. These theories remained unofficial, but within the scientific underground of the Soviet Union, they generated quiet fascination. Reports began to circulate that Rykov's work had drawn the attention of individuals connected to the KGB. Although hard documentation is scarce, several witnesses and former researchers later claimed that a special research group was formed around Rykov's methods, operating in secrecy, with restricted access and no public reporting. Some sources have linked this group to an alleged program known as SMERCH, which, according to unconfirmed accounts, was tasked with investigating whether memory, personality, or even fragments of identity could be transferred or induced artificially. These claims should be treated with caution, as there are no official archives confirming the existence of such a program. However, multiple interviews and references in post-Soviet literature suggest that interest in Rykov's experiments went far beyond academic curiosity. One of the unspoken goals, according to later recollections, was to understand whether a human personality could be altered, intentionally or accidentally, through hypnosis. Could a memory be implanted? Could another identity be invoked or downloaded? Could consciousness, in some form, be shared, merged, or displaced? These were the kinds of questions that Rykov's sessions had unintentionally raised. Although his work remained grounded in the language of psychology, it flirted with concepts that bordered on metaphysics and spiritual science. In Western terminology, what Rykov seemed to uncover bears resemblance to what would later be called walk-in phenomena, the idea that a soul or consciousness might enter a living person's body and coexist or even replace the original identity. Rykov never made such claims himself. He remained publicly loyal to the constraints of Soviet science, even as his experiments continued to push those boundaries. Yet for those who observed the results firsthand, the implications were undeniable. These were not cases of imagination or performance. Something real was happening. Whether it was a psychological anomaly, an undiscovered mechanism of memory retrieval, or something far stranger, Rykov had opened a door that others were afraid to name. And if the state was indeed watching, it was not because they feared hypnosis. It was because they saw, perhaps for a fleeting moment, the possibility of something much more profound. In the final years of the Soviet Union, another little-known initiative quietly emerged, one that, according to scattered accounts and leaked interviews, carried the code name Enigma. Unlike previous programs that focused on influence or weaponization, Enigma was primarily observational. Its reported purpose was to study individuals who claimed to receive information from the dead, so-called contactees, mediums, or sensitives who experienced what they described as spontaneous communication from beyond. This included vivid dreams involving deceased relatives, messages received through automatic writing, and unexpected visual images that, in some cases, were later verified by facts the person should not have known. One frequently cited but still anecdotal case involved a Soviet engineer who reportedly received a fully formed technical solution in a dream. The idea, according to accounts, was well outside his area of expertise. Yet when the concept was tested, it proved not only viable but surprisingly effective in a real-world application. This raised difficult questions. Where had the information come from? Was it subconscious synthesis? Or something else? The interest from state security agencies was not spiritual, it was strategic. If human beings could access accurate, previously unknown information through means not explained by conventional neuroscience, that capability could have value: scientific, technological, even military. According to later testimony, the KGB took an active but covert interest in such occurrences. There is no official documentation confirming the existence of a project named Enigma, and it is important to be clear on that point. However, the name appears in several memoirs and second-hand accounts from former Soviet researchers who worked in laboratories specializing in anomalous phenomena. Between 1988 and 1990, multiple facilities, particularly in the Baltic states and the Ural region, are said to have conducted experimental sessions involving individuals who claimed to perceive or sense the presence of the dead. These were not public demonstrations, but tightly controlled studies where the subjects were monitored by doctors, engineers, and occasionally security officers. Sessions were recorded. Instruments were used to track temperature shifts, magnetic fields, and other potential anomalies in the environment. Some of these sessions reportedly produced measurable changes, small drops or rises in temperature localized around the subject, or weak electromagnetic disturbances coinciding with moments of claimed contact. These findings were controversial, even within the research teams. Some dismissed them as noise or equipment sensitivity. Others believed they were observing an unknown interaction between mind and environment. Articles discussing similar effects began appearing in popular science journals in the early 1990s, once censorship had begun to loosen. These articles rarely named sources, but hinted at larger classified bodies of research behind them. Skeptics rightly point out that much of this data lacks peer-reviewed publication or verifiable documentation. But what is not disputed is the Soviet state's consistent interest in any phenomenon that appeared to fall outside the traditional scientific framework, especially if it hinted at practical applications. The question that seemed to drive the Enigma group was not whether the soul existed or whether the dead could speak. It was far more pragmatic. If information can reach a living mind through non-physical channels, what are the mechanisms, and can they be replicated? Behind the official silence and lack of records lies a pattern that matches other confirmed projects of the era. Observing contactees, documenting spontaneous knowledge, and analyzing unexplained experiences were not acts of curiosity. They were part of a broader effort to map the limits of consciousness and perception. The deeper motive was clear. If information is not confined to the physical brain, then our entire understanding of intelligence, communication, and even life itself might be incomplete. Whether the answers came from the subconscious, a shared field of awareness, or something that begins after death. The fact remains, these cases were taken seriously, and someone, somewhere, was listening. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Nearly all of the classified projects mentioned earlier were quietly dismantled. Laboratories were shut down, funding was cut off, and the researchers themselves scattered. Some moved into private business, some emigrated abroad, and others simply disappeared from public view. As the institutions that had once housed these investigations dissolved, so too did their archives. Some materials were lost entirely. Others were absorbed into newly created Russian agencies, their contents unknown and their access restricted. What remained was a vacuum. Fragments of reports, rumors, and a lingering sense that something significant had been left unfinished. Among researchers and fringe communities, one persistent rumor began to circulate in the 1990s, that a portion of the data from Project PSI, particularly the more sensitive or provocative findings, had been acquired by foreign entities. Most notably, some claimed that representatives of the Vatican had shown interest in these documents and may have even obtained copies through unofficial channels. To be clear, there is no confirmed evidence to support this claim. The idea largely stems from interviews with ufologists, retired military officers, and independent investigators who worked on the periphery of Soviet science. These accounts are anecdotal and should be treated with skepticism. Nevertheless, the rumor persists, fueled perhaps by the sheer volume of missing documentation and the sudden silence that followed years of covert research. A more plausible theory is that some of the archives were transferred to the United States during the early 1990s under the pretense of scientific and technological cooperation. This kind of data exchange did occur, particularly in fields like aerospace and nuclear science. It's not unreasonable to suspect that documents relating to human consciousness, especially those gathered by military-affiliated research units, may have been included in the process. But once again, no hard evidence has surfaced. What we know for certain is this: the core materials from these programs are not publicly accessible today. Requests for declassification have gone unanswered, and former researchers, those willing to speak, often admit that even they do not know where the final reports ended up. Some of those who worked on these studies have gone on record to say that just before the programs ended, they believed they were on the verge of a major discovery. Not a spiritual revelation, but a scientific one. Something about the structure of consciousness, the possibility of information existing outside the body, or even the measurable presence of awareness after death. But that momentum was lost. The reasons remain unclear. Perhaps it was a casualty of regime change as new political and economic priorities emerged in the early years of the Russian Federation. Or perhaps, as some speculate, there was a deliberate decision to suppress the findings, not because they were false, but because they were too disruptive. Since then, the topic has largely vanished from serious academic discourse. The institutions that once supported this work have either disbanded or shifted focus, and the next generation of scientists was trained to ignore what had come before. Only a few independent researchers and historians continue to investigate, combing through memoirs, scattered publications, and surviving documents in search of answers. What they've uncovered suggests that the Soviet state took these questions seriously. Questions about whether consciousness truly ends with the body, or if something remains. But until the documents are found, or officially released, we may never know just how close Soviet science came to proving something that humanity has wondered for millennia. For now, we are left with speculation, second-hand testimony, and a profound sense that the truth might have slipped just beyond our reach. Whether it was suppressed, lost, or simply forgotten, the legacy of these investigations remains buried in a shadowed chapter of history, one that still refuses to close. The story of a state that officially denied the existence of the soul, yet quietly funded research that could have proven it, sounds like a contradiction. But it is, in fact, reality. Behind the rigid facade of official science, experiments were conducted that had the potential to radically alter our understanding of death, consciousness, and what it means to be human. Today, all we have are fragments, interviews, memoirs, and scattered traces of lost research. Some of it feels unbelievable, some disturbingly logical. But one thing is clear. The curiosity about what lies beyond death was not limited to philosophers and mystics. It extended to those in power, those with access, resources, and a reason to keep the findings hidden. Maybe one day, the full archives will be opened. Until then, they remain silent. And we are left wondering, what did those who first crossed the threshold of death discover, and why did they choose to keep it from the rest of the world? Dear friends, thanks for watching. If you liked this video, please like it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you soon.